Hi. You may have seen Professor Jiang's lecture series called Secret History under his channel called Predictive History, not to be confused with Harry Seldon's Psychohistory in Isaac Asimov's novels. Two completely different things. Professor Jiang presents over multiple different lectures alternative views of reality, as we may have heard them previously in Decentralized Conspiracy Theories. With titles ranging from The Birth of Evil to Death by Bureaucracy, somehow he manages to take a spoon and dip into the depths of physics, economics, neuroscience, thermodynamics, theology, and mix it all together into something somewhat coherent. You may have had a similar experience as me watching the series, which is a mixture of mentally shutting down and being revived by the next incredible link that he makes between Dante, R.F. Kennedy's assassination, neuroscience, smoothed over with his gentle.
Okay.
Since his series is being uploaded in real time and we're at about lecture 10 at the moment of filming, I wanted to take a stab at actually picking apart some of his ideas. I wanted to give you a stronger taste than just the dip of the spoon which he gives, specifically into the topic of neuroscience, which he mentions in his 9th lecture, The Theory of Everything. In his lecture, based on my inference of a pretty hefty 1-hour explanation of many different topics, my main takeaway refers to the following line, which he says:
We can never know this reality. Why? Because whenever we see reality, we filter it using time and space. Okay? So time and space do not exist outside of us. They are parts of us. We use time and space in order to interpret reality in a way that allows us to make sense of it. Okay?
Now, this might sound more philosophical, or a lot of people might be immediately thinking, that sounds whimsical. Of course, there is objective truths. Professor Jiang calls on multiple different philosophers as well as Schrodinger's cat to present how we don't actually observe objective reality, but all that we're doing is collapsing the wave function. Now, the wave function refers to quantum mechanics. This is a superposition. This is where a particle exists in multiple different states. As a particle and as a wave function, it simply exists as a spectrum of probabilities of what it could possibly be until we assign observational reality onto it by looking at it or by measuring it via our instruments, which, when we're interacting with the real world, are our sight, our touch, our smell, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into the quantum physics. I think it would be best for someone else to pick this one apart, and truly this is not my line of interest or research. In his lecture, Professor Jiang states, "We do not have currently a model for how we think. In fact, if you study neuroscience, you will find that there are lots of gaping holes in our understanding of the brain." Okay, he also says this: "All of nature is vibrational, it's energy, and it's only when we observe it, when you interact with it, that becomes something solid that we see and measure and touch. Okay, it's called a wave function collapse." Now, I just want to caveat and say that just because we don't know something doesn't mean that there isn't an objective reality out there. Reality doesn't just depend on us, and the world isn't an illusion. We just need to be aware of the fact that we won't ever be able to touch reality in a raw way. We'll always be just measuring it via our own senses. As a way of fleshing out some of Professor Jiang's theories and presenting you with a relatively recent neuroscientific theory, I wanted to fill out his arguments so potential viewers of his videos, like myself, aren't left wide-eyed and mentally congested with the amount of questions that they have. In 2010, Carl Friston proposed the free energy principle. Here are its main points. Why do we do anything? Why does anything change? Why is there plasticity in our brains? Why do we have actions and behaviors? Well, we have them in order to optimize. What are we trying to optimize? We're trying to optimize the chances for survival. How does optimizing our chances of survival look like? Well, it means literally avoiding chaos and avoiding disorder. What Carl Friston actually proposes is that we are in a constant state of chaos and disorder. Now, this doesn't just need to be philosophical. This can be on a physical, atomic level. Atoms want to spread across concentration gradients. We essentially have a natural state of being pulled apart. Our energy that we keep within us wants to be freed. We essentially want to be torn apart and for the particles to go along the concentration gradient to fill out the space that we're in. That's not to sound too dramatic. Of course, this would come at a cost of our lives, so we have to actually keep the energy within us tied together and go against that. How do we cope with that? We have to actually resist Entropy. What is entropy? Essentially, you might have heard it in films like Tenet, or in some other theories of thermodynamics potentially, but it's kind of what we use in order to define uncertainty. Let's just use entropy as a way of defining the current states of possibilities that something can be in. So we want to resist entropy, essentially. We want to keep all of our particles together in one state, which is us, or within a defined range of states that keep us alive. And so we do that by being aware of what's going on in our environment and actually acting in response to that. Friston literally states, biological agents must therefore minimize the long-term average of surprise to ensure that their sensory entropy remains low. In other words, biological systems somehow manage to violate the fluctuation theorem, which generalizes the second law of thermodynamics. Friston literally defines a formula for this mathematically, where our optimization refers to the free energy principle, or where we're trying to minimize the amount of free energy that we have. Now we're going to have a look at this formula and kind of take it apart. But first I want to kind of introduce you to an analogy that I think will help explain this in a little bit more of a simple way. So let's imagine that you are a living thermometer. Now here is our little thermometer guy. So there aren't many things that you need to do in order to stay alive, but you know that you need to keep your internal mercury within a narrow range. So too high and you burst, and too low and you freeze. That range is your set of viable states. So the physical conditions that are compatible with your existence. You take readings via your glass ends, so that's your sensory input, over here and over here. And inside of you, the height of your mercury represents your belief, so your internal best estimate of what the external reality is. So underpinning this system is a generative model that's consistently giving you estimations. Some of the expectations that come out of the generative model might be something along the lines of, if the sun shines, my mercury rises. If I move into shade, I cool. And if I'm near others, I stay stable. Now let's go back and maybe tie some of these variables that we see in these mathematical formulas into some of the things that I've just described in our little thermometer bodies. So our observation here, our O, is our raw sensory input. Okay, so that's just our observation. It's what we kind of are sensing at the tips. Okay, now here mu is our belief, and that's our current belief. So that's what we actually are finding in terms of the height of our mercury. Our M over here is our generative model. And as you can see here, I've kind of written out in words what these formulas, both of them, actually represent. So you have a representation of expected energy minus the entropy. And again, we're trying to minimize this free energy. And by doing that, we kind of want our expected energy to equal to entropy. So then the free energy is essentially zero. Okay, some other terms that might need to be defined refer to the S over here, which is the true temperature. This is what we're trying to obviously get a feeling for, and we want to reach the best prediction of this in order to make the best decisions as to what we should do, given the true temperature. Now our Q of the S is what our belief is about this true temperature. Okay, so our P over here essentially refers to what our data actually implies. We've got a few things going on here. We have our belief and then what our data implies, and they're being compared to see what their divergence is. So we have our belief and what the data actually implies and how far apart they are in some kind of numeric value. This part actually represents entropy. So again, this is the entropy of our raw sensory input. How much uncertainty is associated with our observation? And of course, we want to minimize this. Okay, so I hope that kind of explains where we're getting free energy from. We get our free energy from expectations that are violated and our uncertainty basically of our observations that we're seeing. Now let's just tie this down really concretely to our thermometer example. So suppose that your model predicts that in the shade, the air temperature is 15 degrees Celsius. So we go into the shade, and we're predicting that we're going to be 15 degrees Celsius over here. That's what our internal mercury is showing us, because that's what our expectation is. So that's your belief, and that's your mu factor over here. But your glass sensors actually tell you 30 degrees Celsius. Now, that's a violation or a divergence, because 15, or your belief, does not equal the data implication, that is 30 degrees Celsius, as we're seeing here. Since our possibilities of taking ranges of temperature span quite a big range of what we could possibly sense, the entropy of our observation is also relatively high. So essentially we're in a mode of surprise because our entropy is high and our violation of our expectations is also high. There is a high tension between what we expect and what we actually experience. So what do we do in order to survive this? We can't stay in this state of high tension where we basically don't have a good internal representation of the external surrounding areas that we are in. We can't act properly and we are more at risk of death essentially. Especially if, for example, 30 degrees that we're sensing isn't within our livable range of possible states. If 30 degrees, for example, would take our mercury levels all the way to the top and make us essentially combust, which isn't realistic, but let's say for the example, it's a possibility. Okay, so which of these parts of the equation do you actually have control over as somebody who has free will and actionability within the world? Well, you can change your belief. You can also change your generative model. And you can also change the observations that you take. So let's say that as a thermometer, I'm taking two different readings at the moment. I'm taking 30 from the bottom, but I'm also taking, let's say, 15 from the top. Now, instead of focusing my attention on the 30 over here, I can actually shift my attention to focus only on the 15 degrees over here. It doesn't really involve anything physically changing or even any kind of movements. That would mean that I would have a belief and an outside reading that would be matching. And so my free energy is actually minimized here. So then that would also tick off my box. What can I also do? Well, I can actually change the way in which I'm understanding the outside relative to my inside. I can maybe change my generative model and say, okay, well, it looks like I just need to half everything that I'm sensing on the outside relative to my inside. Now, this is something along the lines of actually changing the way in which you understand how you're taking readings yourself. If, for example, you admit to yourself that it looks like my readings are wrong at the tips of my bulbs, maybe there's some cracks there, maybe there's some leakage, something on these lines, you can change your generative model to basically state every reading that I'm taking from my senses needs to be halved in order to represent the true outside temperature, which is 15 degrees, in my internal representation of it, which is also 15 degrees and what I would be expecting to see in the shade. Well, what's the last thing that you can do? You can actually move. You can take your reading of 30 degrees over here and say that doesn't actually correspond to your internal belief of what this area should be like. So instead of actually changing anything about how you internally believe this area should be like, you go into an even deeper shady area where it is actually 15 degrees and therefore your internal belief corresponds to your outside and you don't need to think about the other area ever again. And therefore you minimize your free energy. What does this actually look like when it comes to psychological issues and the brain and humans? If we have a look at this formula again and look at it in terms of the brain, this is what we're seeing. So again, mu represents the shifting of attention. So just a cognitive reinterpretation of what you're already seeing, not having to change any of your neural structures, not having to take any actions, but all of a sudden I'm seeing things in a different way. But it's the exact same things that I'm seeing, just added together to give you a different conclusion or a different belief. You can also similarly change your generative model. So this is kind of like the neuronal architecture that you have in your brain. We have plasticity, where it changes the parameters of what's possible to be linked together. This is where memory comes from. This is where you're able to learn new skills. You're able to change your generative model and expand your possibilities. You can also change your surrounding areas that you are in. This is kind of what people refer to when they say that people go into echo chambers, where people tend to self-validate their own opinions and go around with people who are self-confirming of the same opinion. Now, essentially, they're not doing anything wrong there. They have a set state of free energy where they feel like their existence is possible, and they're minimizing that by going around people where the expectations remain within the set boundaries, where there's less danger around, where there's less things that go against their beliefs. And so this free energy is minimized, and that's also a way of doing that. So those are the 3 ways in which we can actually change our free energy, according to Friston. Now, notice that you are much more complex than a thermometer. All of your senses are really, really comprehensive, and sometimes there might be something wrong with them even in a slight way. To actually be able to be aware of that and to change your generative model or change your observations or your actions based on that is really, really hard, and actually takes a lot of computing in order to do. Now, Friston, of course, acknowledges this, and so his mathematical formulas are much, much more broad, and I really, really have only scratched the surface of what he proposes here, if I even scratch the surface in a correct way in my generalization of it. Now, what does this actually mean on the surface level? This means that you were able to minimize your free energy and keep it within the states that your existence continues to be viable by basically making your sensations fit your internal beliefs, or changing your internal beliefs to fit your sensations that you're sensing from the outside. And again, what happens when we're not able to perceive the outside anymore? What happens when your thermometer gets stuck in place and your mercury is fixed at a certain point and you're not able to gain a real understanding of what the outside is anymore? You lose your capacity for learning, for perceiving, for changing in reaction or for acting. Now, this happens when your internal state essentially can no longer support external causes that are inputted into it. This can happen in humans, for example, in neurodegenerative diseases, or things where basically you're unable to react to the environment in a way that allows you to control or to be receptive to the reality. So that's maximum entropy. That's maximum free energy, when the realm of possibilities is so high that you are no longer able to take correct choices. Without this conscious control of entropy, all roads lead to particles going along the concentration gradient, or disintegration essentially, in the long term. In the short term, it just means death. Again, there are 3 ways in which to control this, and that's perceptual inference, that's actions on the world, and that's changing your belief system and your model. Now, taking a step all the way back and referencing again Professor Jiang, what is he trying to tell us here with this lecture? He's trying to tell us to be aware of this model and of your own model. He tells you to recognize how your brain expects the world to work and question it, because your model isn't always correct.
So now the question then is, if our current model of reality doesn't really work, what is another possibility? Okay? And in this class, I'm not trying to tell you what is true, but I'm just trying to present to you new possibilities.
You can ask yourself, is the model serving me? Is it outdated? Should I change my perceptions? Should I change my internal model? Has it been constraining me? Have I got biases here? When you become aware of your model, you start to become aware of meta-conception. You become not just the thermometer, but the thermometer that knows that it is a thermometer. So I think, therefore I am, kind of thing. And when you do that, you change the ways in which you minimize free energy. You don't just change your attention or your perceptual pathways in the way of you're getting 2 different readings and you focus on the reading that is giving you the one that feels most accurate to you based on your current beliefs. You can also rewrite and change the calibration itself, so you can rewrite your model. That is kind of what deep learning is in free energy principle sense. Or even in simpler terms, you kind of stop being surprised by your life and the things that are going on within it because you change your conception of it. You update the map, not just your position within the map. And that's kind of what Professor Jiang is saying in his lectures. Another thing that's really central within Professor Jiang's lectures is this kind of societal implication where he states that we are currently in a war of perception and we always will be.
So if we all believe God exists, guess what? God exists. We all believe sin exists, sin exists. Okay? That's why this war, it's not over resources, it's over perception. Do you understand? This is a war of perception. If I can get everyone in the world to believe that God is dead and Satan is a true God, I win.
So that phrase can kind of sound a bit abstract, but once we understand the free energy principle, I think it becomes a little bit more concrete. So every brain and every living system survives by aligning its internal model with the external perceptions and the signals that it's receiving from the outside. But we can also question what happens when the signals themselves are manipulated by external actors. What happens when what we perceive is no longer actually guided by reality, when that 30-degree reading is actually somebody that's put a fire under you? Well, the result is that we have chronic prediction error. We're constantly in a mode of surprise that this could happen or that could happen. The realm of possibilities is so wide that we are no longer able to fully predict or stay low in this free energy principle mode. And seen this way, like the so-called war of perception isn't just cultural, it's literally systemic. Every institution, whether it's a government or a company, is trying to give you the constraints of a generative model and putting it upon you. It's trying to be in control of the shaping of the generative model that we have internally. For example, in a society such as we are now, where we have high levels of free energy, we crave narratives and stories that reduce that free energy and that help us align our internal model with a lower amount of free energy and belief system, even if they're false. This is why, historically speaking, we have ups and downs with liberal and conservative societies that kind of follow on from each other. After a liberal boom, we often have conservative mindsets that want to lower the free energy that is out there through this uncertainty and this newness. And that's dangerous because truth, real objective truth, actually requires a little bit of surprise. And we need to be able to tolerate that. Given that we have readings of 30 degrees Celsius and our belief is that we should truly be in 15 degrees, given that we're in the shade right now and the sun isn't directly on us, doesn't mean that we are correct. We are surprised and that's okay. And we need to therefore calculate, given our state of what we're actually capable of sensing right now, whether or not our belief is correct or the external world is correct, and what we should do in order to minimize the free energy that is created because of this divergence. As Professor Jiang states, most people tend to actually not update their internal belief, and instead they tend to either move into a place where it is 15 degrees or they start changing their attention to selectively pick out what does fit in with their internal model. And that's kind of what the free energy principle is saying. It's not a moral guide as to what you should and shouldn't do. It's helping you understand why you actually do want to minimize your free energy. We're not actually guided towards finding objective truth. This isn't the core of our living, but we can change our ways and use the methods that we have available to us to actually direct us into finding objective truth if we want to do that. So that's kind of all I have to say around the topic. So far anyway. I kind of wanted to give a quick picking apart of my thoughts. I don't think they're super comprehensive, and I think if you're really interested in it, I would read Carl Friston's 2010 paper that proposes the free energy principle, as well as watching all of the rest of Professor Jiang's lectures, as crazy as they seem. And I'm going to continue picking apart these thoughts as well. So I hope that you have a good day and see you soon.